Hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in the states of West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are talking to an accomplished writer with us today about her latest novel, and she's also not only an accomplished writer, but an accomplished creative writing professor at the University of North Carolina A&T. And our guest today is Valerie Nieman, and she joins us today as we're going to be talking about her latest novel, To the Bones, and also her writing career and what she's been doing as a writer over the last several years. And she is the author of 4 novels. To the Bones is her most recent book. Blood Clay, a novel of the New South, one of her other novels, was honored with the Eric Hoffer Prize in General Fiction. A novel about the Rust Belt of the 1970s survivors is also one of her works, and her first book, Nina Gathering, was reissued in 2012 as a classic in the post-apocalyptic genre. And another novel is now in submission, and she is at work on a narrative based on a month of hiking solo in Scotland. So she's been very accomplished and continues to be very prolific. Her third poetry collection, Leopard Lady, A Life in Verse, debuted with a reading at the Coney Island Museum. Her second poetry collection, Hotel Worthy, appeared in 2015 from Press 53, and poems from that book were nominated for the Pushcart Prize and Best Short Fictions of 2016, where the title poem was a finalist. She's also the author of Wake, 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 and a collection of short stories, Fidelities. Valerie Nieman graduated from West Virginia University and Queen's University of Charlotte. She's a former newspaper reporter and editor, and as we mentioned, she teaches creative writing at North Carolina A&T State University and at venues ranging from the John C. Campbell Folk House to Writer House as well. And we're delighted to have Valerie Nieman with us today. So Valerie, welcome to the program. Good to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Eliot. It's great to be here.
I loved your book, To the Bones, and I've read some of your other work, and I had a chance to really dive in and get an advanced copy of To the Bones, and I absolutely loved it. And I want to start with the very first line of the book because I think it just sets everybody up and sets the reader up for what's to come. And the first line of Chapter 1 kind of opens like this, and I'll have you kind of give us some context into what's happening here. The first line is, "Horrible smell, dark, cold. This is how it feels to be dead." So what's going on there in Chapter 1, and who feels like they are dead?
Okay. I had a farm in north central West Virginia, and on the back of it was a mine crack. And I used to always say, well, if I ever murdered somebody, I'd throw them down the mine crack. You know, kind of a off the top of my head thing. But I was complaining to a friend I was having a hard time getting going with a new novel, and I made that crack that, I should just murder somebody and throw them down a mine crack. And he said, well, do it. So I did. So that's where the book starts, really playing with some of the time-worn, even cliches about Appalachia. He gets off the highway at the wrong place and gets clopped over the head and thrown down a mine crack, where he wakes up battered and bloody and finds out he's in a pit full of human bones.
Very good. And this person that we follow, who's a great character, Derek, who is a government auditor, needless to say. And as you mentioned, he's kind of bloodied in that chapter, sort of disoriented from a gaping head wound. And when he kind of staggers out, he does get up and stagger out, not to give too much away, but he finds himself in a place called Redbird, West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And I really liked this book because the setting is so important. And I think some of my favorite books are those in which the setting is really integral to the story. So tell us a little bit about Redbird, West Virginia, where Derek sort of finds himself.
Redbird is a small coal mining community in Carbon County, West Virginia. So this is an imaginary place, kind of northern coalfieldish, because that's where I lived and worked for many, many years. So it's deep coal. And he finds himself in this little town, which is really on its ragged edge. The coal is kind of going away, but there's nothing replacing it. Kind of the familiar story we see in Appalachia now. Where do we go from here? Well, the problem in Redbird is that there's a controlling family that kind of owns everything. Owns the coal, owns the surface, owns pretty much everything in the town and runs it the way they want. So as the story evolves, we see a number of mysteries that are playing out that Derek will become enmeshed in. One is what's happened to the river, which is flowing bright orange with acid mine drainage. And another one is what's happening to people who are disappearing. A couple of women, some other people just have vanished off the face of the earth in this community.
And I know that in addition to kind of following Derek's progression as a character in some of the investigations that he's looking at. There's another person who is looking for one of those missing people in the town. That is Lorena Taylor, who is a sweepstakes operator, and she's trying to find clues that might lead to what happened to her missing daughter, Dreama. So they're kind of two characters running parallel tracks as they uncover these different mysteries. Can you talk a little bit about the Cavanaughs? Because they do sort of have this mafia-like hold over Redbird in terms of what goes on there, but despite the fact that their presence looms large, they kind of are in the background a little bit in terms of they don't come out much, they don't come out of their compound much, and people are kind of afraid to take them on. So tell us a little bit about the Cavanaughs.
Well, Lorana really details who they are to Derek fairly early on, that they're a family who came here before the Civil War, and by guile, luck, bullying, thievery, who knows what, they managed to be on the right side of everything and get control of more and more and more and more. And in a generation or two back, a legend sort of started around them. They said that the Cavanaughs can strip a man to the bones. And of course, Derek hears this, and this is the kind of thing, like a father would say, I'm gonna tear the hide off you, or something like that, which means nothing. Well, in Redbird, it does mean something. So these reclusive coal millionaires who run everything and who do not interact with the community anymore, but everyone lives in fear of them because they can do kind of as they wish in this community. They've co-opted the police, they've co-opted the local authorities. It's kind of like a Western in those towns where you've got the land baron who runs everything, kind of playing with that idea of the town that is under someone's control.
Yeah, very good. I found them fascinating, and I sort of compared them, we were talking about this earlier, I compared them to Francine Whiting's character in Richard Russo's Empire Falls, where she has that same function in that story in Empire Falls, which is a town in rural Maine, where her influence and money and favors that she has done to help certain characters over the years has sort of ingratiated everybody into her debt. And in this case, the Cavanaughs function with that kind of hovering, heavy-handed quality as well. There's one character you're talking about, the police sort of being in the back pocket of the Cavanaughs, but there's a smaller character, Marco De Luca, who's a disgraced deputy in the character, and he kind of, a secondary character, kind of a disgraced character that helps Derek and Lorana. Can you talk a little bit about him, and why is he disgraced, and what is kind of his motivation for helping those two characters?
Well, Marco has a lot of motivations. He's a pretty complex character for a secondary character. He's a military veteran, had been a deputy and detective for the sheriff's department, but when Lorana's daughter Dreama disappeared, he just wouldn't let it go. He was told, let it go. Like with the environmental activists who disappeared and other people, just let it go, and he wouldn't. And so he was eventually pushed off the police force entirely. He's now working as a janitor and not very happy about that. He's wanting to help Lorana because he had a crush on her in high school, and this is a small town. Those crushes don't go away.
Yeah, very good. So I wanted to ask you a question about something else we talked about before our interview. When you said you were writing this novel, you had a lot of fun with it, and it's very evident in the way you set things up, and it's such a great story, but that you were trying to kind of push the boundaries of the genre a little bit and push it into maybe a new strata or a new area. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, I set out, I had started out writing genre. My first book, Nina Gathering, was a post-apocalyptic set in Appalachia. So I have roots going back in that area. And I just thought about pulling together all of these different genre forms and some of the ideas and stereotypes that sort of circulate and really pushing them, out of reality into something over the top. So the Cavanaughs have a sort of legendary power in addition to their monetary power. They have a preternatural kind of power. And Derek McBran, who wakes up in the pit of bones, comes into a power that he never had before and that is very much at war with his personality, which is very retiring and, under the radar, don't do anything, just, stay out of trouble. So I really wanted to push into fantasy, horror, Appalachian tall tale. You think about the various stories. I think particularly of Ruth Ann Musick with her Telltale Lilac Bush, and the book that's stolen more than any other book in West Virginia libraries, or used to be. I don't know anymore, but I would bet. So great stories about ghost miners and different kinds of animal creatures and people who have powers. And so I think Appalachia is such a fertile ground for that. I think of all the writers, Manly Wade Wellman, when I read his books about Silver John the Minstrel, and all of these wonderful monsters, and Flatwoods and the Mothman and stuff. So there's just really fertile ground for this here. And I just enjoyed kind of pulling all those together, along with a through story that's more serious about environmental devastation and acid mine drainage and how people misuse the environment for profit in Appalachia.
And that is something that, no matter how many books are written about that, either from a fictional perspective, nonfiction perspective, memoir perspective, that's still going on. Sort of the pillaging of the land and the pollution. It just seems like decade after decade, generation after generation, it just continues, and sometimes it expands, sometimes it contracts, but it's a very real part, unfortunately,
Yes.
a negative part of Appalachian culture. I want to ask you about your writing process, too, about when you got the idea to do To the Bones or some of the other works that you've worked on, your poetry collections, your short story collection. When you get an idea, what's your process like? And when you're doing something like a novel, how do you work towards getting that first draft completed?
Okay. This book was really different. I am usually a slow writer. It takes me 4 or 5 years to get a novel done. Often because I'm doing a lot of research, I'm really trying to, and I said, I just want to write something fast and fun that I know from my heart. And as I say, I worked as an environmental reporter, coal industry reporter here in north central West Virginia, and I also farmed. And so all of these landscapes and these stories are just up there, and so I could just draw on that and draw on people and places I knew and sort of meld them and merge them around. So I went into this really wanting to do a mashup, different forms coming, different genre, and so I thought I need to make my structure very simple. So the story is a very standard structure. There's nothing weird going on in terms of how it's put together. It goes from beginning to end. You have some flashbacks, and it just moves. It moves very rapidly. One person said it reads like a rocket. I wanted it to do that. I want it to be the kind of book that you just read and it just keeps pulling you forward and pulling you forward. So that was a little different. I didn't really know exactly how it would end. I knew there had to be a final confrontation of some sort, but I didn't know what it would be. And I let the characters and the situations pull me through the book. Things emerge, things happen I didn't expect, which is always what you want. But I was always trying to hew to a pretty tight time frame and keep it tight, which I was taught as a journalist. No wasted effort in here. My other books have tended to be slower, and some of them I knew how the ending was going to come out, and some I didn't. Some Blood Clay, I just sort of, started the characters, this thing happens, and let it go and see where they ended up, which I wasn't at all sure when I went into it. So my process is usually slower and usually more feeling my way through.
So when you write a book like To the Bones, and I love the comment you made about, I wanted to just sit down and write something fast, something from my heart. How does that help you as a writer when it comes to the next project that you're going to work on, where maybe you have to move a little slower and more deliberate because there's research and other components involved? Does that help you in a way because you were able to kind of do something a little different that was still substantive in some way, but different than your usual process? Does that kind of reinvigorate you and make that next work easier as you get into it, or how does that whole step, those
I
steps
think
work?
it's going to be good for me because I found out that I can work more rapidly, and just writing through and then going back and revising. I have, unfortunately, from years of being a newspaper reporter and editor, I tend to revise as I go, and that slows you down. I've always felt like, oh, that line isn't very good, that paragraph isn't very good, and so I'm slow. And with this one, I just said, I don't care if that line's no good, just keep going, get this done. And I finished it in under a year, which for me is just phenomenally fast, and I think that has been a good influence. I'm reworking a novel that I've been sending around, and it's another odd crush genre book, but I'm doing some changes in it. It has a rural murder mystery in it as well, but it just has never quite gelled. And so I'm going to make a few changes and start it out again. It's called How I Remembered It. And after I do that, I'm going to go back to the memoir and travel piece set in Scotland. And beyond that, maybe Derek will come back. There may be a sequel.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. So WVU Press was your publisher for To the Bones. How did you meet up with them, and what was the process like working with them and working with University Press?
I worked with WVU Press quite a number of years ago for my short story collection. They published that, and I am a problem child because I write all over the place. Post-apocalyptic science fiction, Rust Belt realism, Southern crime novel, and now this genre mashup, and then my poetry goes other places. Editors and publishers tend to be a little askance of that because people want to go to the shelf and they know when they pick that book off. As you could see what happened with J.K. Rowling. When she wanted to do something different, she came out with a book under a pseudonym and tried to, let her writing go in a different direction. And Stephen King's done that, and other people. And of course, we think of Misery, where the character's trying to get away from his and can't.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I do tend to write all over the place. But I had I had finished To the Bones, and I was still sending How I Remembered It around, and so I pitched that to WVU Press. And Abby Freeland is the acquiring editor there for fiction. And so I talked to her about it, and she read it. And in the process, I mentioned, and I'm finishing up this book that's set in West Virginia coal country, and it has a zombie in it. And her ears almost literally perked up. She said, "Oh, I'd like to read that." And so I said, "Okay, I'll send it to you." So she read both books, and she ended up saying, "I'd really like to publish this one," which made me really happy because I'm just proud to be up from WVU Press. That's where I went to school, and it's great to be with this press, which is doing phenomenal things. They're putting out these magnificent books that are having a huge impact on the discussion of Appalachia and contemporary life here and environment and coal, all of these things. So to have my novel in that company just makes me so proud.
So you mentioned that you write in so many different genres and kind of different niches within those genres. Who are some writers that influence or inspire you?
Oh, well, I was a solitary child. I lived out in the country, and we had a den, which should have been my father's den, but was actually packed full of everything else. But there was a huge bookcase full of volumes from long dead family members. But among the things I read there in particular, Mark Twain, the entire shelf. Every work he ever did, I read all of them. And Tennyson, his Arthurian sequence had a huge impact. And Poe, I read Poe over and over again. And so those were and Shakespeare. And so those were really, I was a young kid. I shouldn't have been reading those, but I was, and I loved them. And then when I went to school, I didn't much care for the things they wanted us to read, the appropriate things. So I was always going off and reading science or something. But then they put up a rack in the little drugstore in that one-horse town. It's like a one-stoplight town. There were many horses, but only one stoplight. And on that rack, it's like somebody had realized what I needed. There was Bradbury and Le Guin and Heinlein and Herbert and all these great science fiction writers. And I just, one after another, just bought these books and devoured them, and it just changed. When you read Stranger in a Strange Land, and you're like, oh, and you read Left Hand of Darkness, you're like, wow. And so it just blows your brain wide open. And so that was really important. That moved me from sort of more realism and romanticism into science fiction, and I just devoured everything, but those things stand out.
So for writers who are trying to find out what their genre might be, where they might have talents as a writer, what advice would you give to them if they're just starting with an idea to put it into a novel or a short story collection, or maybe they've got the first draft done, but it's been sitting in a drawer in the desk for a while? What advice would you give them kind of next steps forward, no matter kind of where you are in the process of putting a piece together?
I think you have to write the story that comes to you. It may be that you would really like to write X, but the story that keeps gnawing at you is why. And it's gnawing at you for a reason. And so you really have to address that. You can't move away from it. And so I think you need to write the story and then see where it emerges. There's a lot of, I think people like genre mashups now. They like things that break boundaries and are fluid. And so I think there's room for that. As I say, if you write in many genres, that sort of makes people a little, but that's okay. It's okay. I guess I'm influenced by Fred Chappell, a North Carolina writer who I met at West Virginia Writers in Cedar Lakes. And he told me, he said, darling, you just got to write the story. And I have ever since. He writes in many, many forms and genres. And also people like Margaret Atwood, who I love, and who writes in many forms and genre. And so I think you get your work out, do the best that you possibly can by the story, and just believe in it.
So back to the bones for just a couple of minutes. The two characters we've talked about earlier, Derek and Lorena, in a way, they come together. There's a little bit of romance involved kind of in the story between those two characters, but they're mismatched. They're kind of mismatched in a lot of ways based on kind of their backgrounds and their experiences. But I think that's kind of a theme of your story, kind of permeating through a lot of that, and through this town, through this Redbird community that you've created. Love does kind of come through, despite the fact that there's sorrow and loss and healthy doses for different characters. There's still a love that kind of binds people together. Can you talk about that as a theme that ties your work together and ties those different characters together?
Lorena's really the one who makes a manifesto, a statement, where she talks about, we live in this place and in many ways it doesn't make good economic sense, and people say we're backward and why don't we just leave, but we love this place and this is where our family is and this is where we know this land, and we go out on this land and we pick up apples and we dig ramps and we hunt, and it's in us, and that if you find a mountaineer anywhere and you start talking to him, just scratch the surface, it's going to come right out. And when I come back to West Virginia, I've been living in North Carolina, but I go under that Wild Wonderful sign, and it's just like, I'm just breathing again. I love North Carolina for many things, but West Virginia is kind of the emotional. That was where I spent the main part of my life, the very formative part of my life, almost 30 years, and so it's in there. And so Lorena's kind of speaking for me and for many people, that whole idea of the West Virginian who's left but always looks back, because there are ties of land and family here that are not easily broken.
And I think we see that culturally in this area, not just in West Virginia, but in Appalachia in general. Even if people are moving from another Appalachian state to a different Appalachian state, the place they were born, as you said, and spent their formative years, there's a motivation to try to get back there, either during their working years or after their working years, when their families are grown and raised and they have a chance to move back. But we see a lot of that in Appalachia, people going back home or trying to get back home permanently, even if they've had to leave for a variety of different reasons. So I think that's really an interesting comment and point to make there too.
I'm literally within a few miles of Appalachia now. For the first time in my life, I live outside of the Ohio River drainage. And it's like 10 miles because of these arbitrary lines. And so it's strange to be outside, but it's always in you. You're not outside.
So I didn't want you to give away the ending of the book, but you kind of teased us a little bit about Derek. We get a sense that maybe there's more adventures for him by the time we get to the end of the book. So where do you see him going next as a character? What do you have planned for him? And I know you may not even be thinking about him working on another project, but sort of big picture, where do you see him going next as a character? Because he's a wonderful character.
Well, what emerges in here is that he has a very murky past. He's a foundling and doesn't know where he came from. He was given a name that is significant. He had no idea until he ran up against the Cavanaughs and their particular interest in ancient legends and lore. And so he's come into his own for the first time in his life. He's gained a confidence as well as a very lethal power that he did not want and can barely control, but he's learning to try to use it for good or to keep it from hurting those he loves. So he's really on that cusp of who am I, where did I come from, and where do I go? And I think that his adventures will take him in search of those roots, where he came out of, where this power may have arisen that he has inherited.
Well, he's a wonderful character, and I'm so happy to hear that there's going to be more adventures for him because I want to read more about him and I want to follow him. And Lorena too.
Yeah.
Yes, I like her too, and I'm glad that those two, because of the connections they forge in the book, those connections are not going to go away. So I'm happy to hear that there's more in store for him because he's a wonderful character. So, Valerie Nieman, what are you working on next?
Well, if I do a sequel, that will come up. I'm working on a Haibun narrative, which is a mixture of prose and poetry. I went to Scotland after my mother's death and didn't really know why I was there. I was doing research, I said, but I kept running into women who saved me, influenced me, taught me, and I realized that I was kind of in search of my mother in some ways, because as a child I'd been a tomboy and I didn't want nothing to do with that women's stuff and babies and cooking and all of that stuff. And so I really pushed her away because I was afraid of that. I didn't want the traditional life. And I kept running into these women and they reminded me of my mother and grandmother, and that kind of, again, Appalachian, that strong woman who may not have education, may not have political power in the world or financial power, but has an immense amount of influence within her family and her community. So I'm working on that. It's a mixture of prose and poetry and kind of feeling my way through that.
Very good. So, Valerie, if anyone in our audience, as we finish up today, want to get in contact with you to talk to you about To the Bones or any of the other works that you've published, where can they, or how can they get in contact with you, first of all, and then where can they get copies of To the Bones and your other works?
Okay. Well, they can get in touch with me through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Val Nieman, Nieman. My name is spelled sort of backwards. And then I have an author page on Facebook, and I have a website, valnieman.com, so they can go there and see where I'm going to be appearing. I'm going to be at some book festivals and readings and this, that, and the other. In terms of buying my books, of course, they're available from the publishers, WVU Press for To the Bones and Press 53 for my poetry, and at independent bookstores like Empire Books, Inner Geek, and as well as online, of course, through the usual outlets such as Amazon. But I really promote indie bookstores because they support writers. So I hope you'll go look there, and they can always order through IndieBound and these and my other titles. Everything is in print except for one book. So
Excellent.
Happy about that.
Well, it's a great collection of work over a variety of different genres, and Valerie Nieman's latest book, To the Bones, has been the one we've been talking about mostly here on Chapters today, but she's also the author of 4 total novels, 3 poetry collections, a short story collection. She's won and been nominated for a number of literary awards for her work, and we're so delighted to be able to talk about your latest novel, To the Bones, and share that with our audience. So congratulations, Valerie, on that, and best of luck to you, and as you keep writing and publishing, we'd love to have you back on to talk more about it. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This has been delightful.
We also want to take a moment to say thanks to the staff and management of the Inner Geek for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to the Inner Geek and pick up a copy of Valerie Nieman's book, To the Bones, and remind you that many of the other author, editor, and publishers featured on the program have their works for sale here at the Inner Geek, formerly Empire Books and News. So come on down to Pullman Square and get any reading taste you have satisfied right here, and we appreciate their support and sponsorship each and every episode here on Chapters. And if you like to get in contact with the program and stay in contact with what we've got going on here on Chapters, we've made that possible through a variety of social media platforms. The easiest way to get in contact with us is through our email address, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. We do ask that you please include the name and town or community in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. If you like to watch programming on YouTube, we have a Chapters page through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is also here at the bottom of the screen. All you need to do when putting that into your search browser is look for the Chapters page in the Chapters tab, and there you can find all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And we also have a Chapters Facebook page, and that address is here at the bottom of the screen for you as well. What's on our Facebook page is our more recent interviews archived there. You can like and comment on those interviews, post those, and reshare those to your Facebook page or any other Facebook page that you may be affiliated with. So if you like Facebook, you like YouTube, you like email, we've made it possible for you to reach out to the program and stay in touch with what we're doing right here. We know many of you have emailed, you've commented on the YouTube videos that you've seen, and shared and reposted the Facebook interviews, and we appreciate all that feedback and support that we do receive. And finally, a programming note. As of this taping, Chapters begins its 5th season of author, editor, and publisher interviews, bringing you some of the best and most talented writers from the states of West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. This program was created as a partnership with Armstrong Television to promote the literary arts in our region and to profile some of those writers, editors, and publishers who are doing outstanding work in writing and publishing and editing and bringing a wide variety of interesting and creative material to you as an audience. But as time goes on, things change. And one of those changes is going to be occurring very soon with the host of this program as we transition away and as I step away as host of Chapters. It has been an honor and a privilege to bring you these interviews over the last 5 years and to help and connect you with some of the best writers and editors and publishers in our community, in our region, and really all throughout the country. And so with that, as we transition and move away, as I move away to take a new job at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi, we are looking ahead and looking at what Chapters is going to look like next year and in the years past that. So let not your heart be troubled. Chapters will continue, and it's going to continue with what I think is going to be an outstanding and an excellent host and a familiar face to many of you and someone who's been a very good friend of this program really from the very beginning of Chapters when we started taping these episodes back in August of 2014. And so it's my pleasure to welcome as the new host of Chapters, Carter Taylor Seaton. And Carter, welcome to Chapters again. We've had you on many times before. You're such a wonderful writer and accomplished artist, but when I say you've been a friend of this program for a long time, you were, because when Armstrong Television and I conceived this idea of doing this program, we needed a couple of episodes to kind of get things started just to see how this would work, and you were the first person I called, and you were my first guest back in 2014.
That's right.
So welcome to Chapters, but just to catch our audience up on you as a writer, give us a little bit of background of who you are, what are you working on, what are some things that you've published in your career as a writer?
Well, I've published 2 novels, Father's Troubles, which was shortlisted for Best Historical Fiction in 2003 by Forward magazine. After that, I published a novel called Amo Amasamat, An Unconventional Love Story, which you'd have to read to find out why it's unconventional. And then I did some nonfiction. I did a book called Hippie Homesteaders, which was sort of a piece of history of West Virginia that nobody had ever recorded, and I didn't know that at the time. I just wanted to document the stories of artists and musicians who came to West Virginia during the hippie movement, the Back to the Land time, and find out why they came and what brought them here, what they encountered when they got here, and that sort of thing. And the fact that they stayed and made a difference in the state I thought was important to cover. So that came out, I think, in 2017, maybe 16. And after that, I did the biography of Ken Heckler, and that's called The Rebel in the Red Jeep. And I spent about 4 years talking to Ken, getting all sorts of tales and digging into the 700 boxes of research he'd done, or things that he had written and put into this book. So those are the 4 things that are published. I have another novel that I hope the publisher's looking at right now. I've done a memoir that about my husband, who was a director of convention centers and sports arenas and so forth for 25 years, and he encountered all the rock stars of the 70s and 80s. So we're kind of documenting some of his funny stories or horrible stories about some of those rock acts.
That sounds great. And I know what's going to make you such a great host of this program is your roots run really deep in this community, and you've grown up here, you've been here, you've written about the people who inhabit here, you've raised family here, and you have children still living here, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Right. So as you think about taking over Chapters, and you think about, not to put you on the spot with what your plans are, but just in general, why is a platform like this, in your opinion, important for authors, important for readers, important for writers, to have a program like this where they can come and talk about their work?
Well, since we are not the New York Times and don't have a review section in the newspaper in this region, it's one of the best ways, if not the few ways, that authors can get their works in front of people and let them know exactly what it's about. And I think one of the questions that people always want to know about authors is, what's your writing process? How do you do that? What even aspiring authors want to know that about other people. And I think it's a platform for that. And what I hope to do is inform the listeners, the watchers, the audience as to any new book that's coming out, maybe things that are sort of different than they hadn't read about before, both fiction and nonfiction.
Very good. Well, I know you're going to do a great job sitting in this chair as you take over Chapters, and it's been an amazing 5 years on the program, and you've had a huge hand in that, both in being willing to come on in those trial balloon episodes we were doing, and also coming back frequently to talk about your outstanding writing career. And I know that Chapters is in good hands. So congratulations, welcome,
Thank
and
you.
I look forward to seeing what you do with the
Thanks.
program.
They're big shoes to fill, but maybe my little feet will fit.
It's very kind of you to say. Thank you, Carter,
Thank
very
you.
much.
I appreciate it.
And finally, I just want to say thank you to Armstrong Television, to all of our viewers, to all of our audience members who have spent so much time watching these episodes, sending us emails, sending us feedback through Facebook and YouTube, making suggestions for authors that we should interview on the program. It's that kind of support and that kind of assistance and that kind of feedback that makes our program grow, has helped our program thrive, and has really helped our program become really a staple in terms of the heartbeat of what's going on in the literary arts in our community. So thank you so very much to you. Thank you so very much to Armstrong for all of your support over the last 5 years. And please keep a close eye on what Carter Seaton is going to do with Chapters, because I know great things are in store for the program. And that will do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.